Welcome back to Online History of Sexuality. This week you are going to read a couple of things. Last week you should have read a chapter from the book Intimate Matters. This week you're going to add to that an article called G.I. Jane, which will deal more with the 1940s. And then you will also be reading the Documents Only from Major Problems, Chapter 11. You can feel free to read the articles, but I think we've all probably worked quite enough. So there you have it. But these chapters and then the documentary, which I've assigned for Wednesday, which I hope is also just fun, but will also tie into the reading material, that will really look at how sexuality is changing in the 1940s and 1950s in the United States. So what's going on in the 1940s? What are some of the important trends? One thing to note is that women are joining the workforce in the 1940s, and this is quite the departure from the Great Depression, when women who were in the workforce were seen as taking jobs away from men and seen very negatively. During World War II, we have a very different ethos going on because, of course, women are encouraged to join the workforce, and they do so often in the defense industries. And this is a little propaganda poster encouraging women to take up sort of the more traditionally masculine jobs, such as welders, crane operators, machinists, etc. And the idea was that if women were part of the defense industries, even if they were doing some of these more masculine kinds of jobs, the idea was that they were freeing men for war service or helping to bring their men back from the war sooner. It's important to note that even in defense industry jobs, women definitely faced a wage disparity, and so they were making a lot less money than male counterparts doing the same jobs. Historians have noted, though, that women were making so much more money than they had ever made before doing these defense industry jobs that they didn't really protest the kinds of wage disparities that they faced. The other thing to note is that for the first time, a lot of married women joined the workforce. And so this was a big deal as well during World War II. It's also important to note, though, that women were expected to give up these jobs when men came back from the war. Labor unions often stipulated that women would have to give up their jobs to men on their return from military service. And one War Department brochure explained, quote, "A woman is a substitute, like plastic, instead of metal." The other thing to note, too, is that employers rarely offered daycare for children of married women or flexible hours. And so that was certainly a challenge for especially married working women. The other thing I should mention is that even while women in defense industry jobs who were maybe doing welding or other sort of more masculine jobs, they were encouraged to retain a certain femininity. And so you would actually see government photographers going into the defense industries, taking photographs of what they thought were some of the prettiest girls doing these jobs so that they could help to convince the American public and even American women that even if you were doing something more masculine or non-traditional in terms of women's roles, you would still be able to maintain your femininity. So this is actually a photograph of a woman who at that time was known as Norma Jean Doherty, but who later became much more famous under the name Marilyn Monroe. So she's actually discovered in the 1940s at a propeller plant in Culver City, California, which, of course, being on the West Coast, was vital to the war in the Pacific. The G.I. Jane article will also talk about how women volunteered for military service during World War II, and about 350,000 women volunteered for service in World War II. They served in non-combatant positions. Many women, for example, worked as nurses. A number of women worked in the Women's Army Corps, and that's the area of service that the G.I. Jane article discusses. So women working for the Women's Army Corps included women working as clerks or typists, stenographers, or drivers. And again, women would go and do this very sort of non-traditional work in terms of traditional gender roles, but under kind of conservative ideology. So again, they are theoretically freeing a man for combat by doing these other kinds of jobs. Pictured there is Ovida Kolb-Hobby, who the article mentions on a number of levels, and someone who is very concerned about dealing with some of the negative stereotypes that women in the military endured. And so she's working very hard, again, to protect the image of women as being feminine, being controlled in their heterosexuality, and trying to dampen this idea that there were women who were involved in homosexual relationships. Women also joined, though, the Women Air Force Service pilots, better known as the WASP. And again, these women were not doing combat kinds of jobs. Instead, their jobs were to ferry bomber and fighter planes from factories to air bases. They would do test flights of new models of planes. And again, the idea here being that they would be freeing a man for combat by doing these non-combatant sorts of jobs. There is a great PBS documentary on the contributions of the Women Air Force Service pilots, and this is the PBS documentary Fly Girls. If you're looking for something, again, both educational and having a great deal of entertainment value, that's worth checking out. So, yeah. The other big contribution that women will make during the 1940s, and this is mentioned in the Intimate Matters chapter that you had to read. Women were part of the military effort as well in the form of pinup girls. So the pinup girls of World War II included, most famously, Betty Grable. She's pictured there for you on the left. Rita Hayworth was known for posing in flimsy nightgowns, and that's exactly what she is wearing in the photograph on the top right. And because black soldiers were also an important part of the war effort, Lena Horne, pictured on the bottom right, was somebody that adorned the barracks of black soldiers. And the idea here for pinup girls was that the pinup girls theoretically gave the U.S. soldiers sort of a reason to fight. They were fighting for the sort of girl at home, the glamorous U.S. woman, what have you, but they were intended to raise morale. Again, that's maybe not my thing, but that's the idea. The other thing to mention about sexuality in the 1940s is we do actually see marriage and birth rates begin to rise, and this had reversed a trend that was the case in the 1930s with the Great Depression. During the Great Depression, people were reluctant to marry. People were reluctant to have a number of children, of course, because there just weren't the funds to support them. So the war seemed to positively impact marriage and birth rates. But divorce rates also begin to tick upward, as do the rates of juvenile delinquency. And sociologists believe that juvenile delinquency was directly tied to World War II and the fact that fathers were away fighting the war and mothers potentially were working in the defense industries. And again, because there just weren't the sort of government facilities around, there weren't like widespread childcare facilities. A lot of kids were latchkey kids and were left home alone unsupervised. And so there was this idea that these unsupervised children were potentially the ones becoming juvenile delinquents. And what was most troubling to folks was that the rise in juvenile delinquency was marked particularly among girls. So that is occurring. And then we have the next little point here. The war also had an impact on the social mores of many young women. So these aren't necessarily unsupervised children, but say teenage girls or late teenage young women. A lot of young women moved to the cities to take on wartime jobs. And as we had seen in the turn of the 20th century, moving to the city, having a job gave them greater independence and possibilities for adventure. A number of young women who were called victory girls actually equated patriotism with having a fling with a young man in uniform before he went overseas. And there's actually a reference to this in the documentary Fly Girls, where one of the women who was a WASP talked about how a young man in uniform was pleading with her for a date and maybe something along with that. And the justification was he was potentially going to be losing his life for the United States, and wouldn't she be willing to do this as a favor to him before he went off to war? And so a number of young women did do this to the point that they were known as victory girls. But the independence of young women, along with the growth of victory girls, raised concerns about the dangers of female sexuality. And this is where the poster comes in. This was a World War II propaganda poster indicating to young enlisted men that the amateur, meaning somebody who wasn't having sex for money, was just as dangerous as the prostitute. And of course, the reference here was to the spread of sexually transmitted diseases. So public health campaigns warned enlisted men that victory girls would have their fun with a soldier and then leave him with a venereal disease, and that would leave him incapable of fighting for his country. The concerns about venereal disease and its connection to actually prostitution remained high during World War II, as they had been during World War I. And Congress actually passed legislation during World War II called the May Act, which permitted for federal intervention in the control of prostitution in areas around army camps if local authorities proved unable to contain prostitution. The other thing to note, too, about the 1940s and World War II in particular is that Friedman and D'Amelio talk specifically about how enlisted men and women did end up contributing to a growth of homosexual subcultures, in part because of their experience as part of the military during World War II. So moving then into the 1950s, just a couple of points in this regard, and then we will call it good. Chapter 12 in Intimate Matters, and again, this is the one that you read just last week, does discuss, and I think this is really interesting because it does tie back to these kinds of issues that we were talking about at the turn of the 20th century and the Meyerowitz chapter. The Intimate Matters chapter discusses the rise of a consumer economy and the impact of that consumer economy on changing middle-class mores. So that's an interesting thing to think about, I think, because I would say that in spite of COVID-19, we still have a consumer-driven economy, and that has led to very interesting changes with regard to this culture's sexual mores. One thing that D'Amelio and Friedman note in the Intimate Matters chapter is that what had been, in terms of maybe 2020 standards, the sort of innocuous pinup girls of the World War II period translates into pornography in general becoming more readily available after World War II. D'Amelio and Friedman will also talk a great deal about Supreme Court decisions that, starting in the 1940s and then reaching into the 50s and 60s, the Supreme Court will really be narrow in how it defines obscenity, which allows for a great deal more of public sexual discourse, whether it's in films, whether it's in books, and so on and so forth. And one of, I think, the really smart comments in the chapter is that this set of Supreme Court decisions, and probably reflecting kind of the public sentiment on the matter as well, is we begin to see a strong reversal of that Comstockian suppression aimed at cutting out public sexual discourse entirely. The other thing that Chapter 12 spends a lot of time highlighting is that sexuality in general, again, this is not the first time this happens, but increasingly in the 1950s, sexuality is commodified and tied to a new ethic, of pleasure. And so again, in the 19th century, sexuality was still tied to reproduction. It was still seen as something that happened primarily within marriage. And now sexuality is increasingly used to sell things to consumers. And it is now seen as something that is certainly more and more divorced from reproduction and instead part of an ethos of pleasure. Very briefly, Chapter 12 does talk about how there is a counter trend in effect during the 1950s, where we do see in the 1950s new efforts to contain the menace of sexual threats. And in this sense, the chapter will talk about those sexual threats being things like pornography, sex outside of marriage, concerns about African Americans and their differing or seemingly differing sexual mores, and then, of course, also the menace of the homosexual subcultures. So that's all coming at you this week. You'll notice on the discussion forum that really what I'm asking you to do is to watch the documentary on the 1950s. There's some really great video footage of some of the things that are going on. But if you have time and if you have the inclination and you know somebody who came of age during the 1950s and you feel brave, feel free to ask a friend, a relative, what that experience was like, because I think that for my parents, a lot of what is discussed in these texts about sexuality in the 1950s, I'm just not sure how much it really impacted their lives. I think that they were, at least in my family, operating by pretty traditional conservative sexual norms still in the 1950s. And I'm sort of curious if you'll find the same in your own families and relatives and friends. So feel free to do that, and I look forward to reading what you find out. That's it.